For a long time, reactions were the go-to system for auto rolls. However, with the new selection menus, this is a more user-friendly experience. So here we have 3 different roles, and let's say I'm interested in HTML and React.js videos. After I leave this, it'll automatically save roles updated, and it'll give my user those roles. Now let's say that I'm no longer interested in React.js, and let's say I just want to see Discord.js videos and HTML videos. Well, it'll automatically update, it'll remove React.js, and now give me the Discord.js video role. And this system here is what I'll be showing you how to make within this tutorial. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Now, real quick, I want to mention that knowing JavaScript is required to follow this video and this entire series. If you don't know JavaScript, don't worry. You can scroll down to the description of this video, and at the top, you'll see JavaScript course. There is an hour-long crash course here on YouTube, which you can right-click and open this in a new tab, so you can watch that after you're done with this video. So in this video, I'll be using the Warnoff-Keys commands npm package. And if you have a different command handler that you're familiar with, feel free to use that one. It won't actually matter as long as you understand how to use it. So within my commands folder, I'm going to make a new file called send.ts. And if you're using JavaScript instead of TypeScript, you'd want to use JS instead. And the goal of this command is to simply send a message. That's because bots cannot edit messages from other users. They can only edit messages that the bot itself sent. So we're going to make a very simple command here that will be able to send a message to a channel. And then from there, we'll have a different command where we can dynamically add whatever roles we want onto a select menu attached to that message. So within this, we have to export an empty object. Within JavaScript, that would be module.exports equals an empty object. And within TypeScript, that would be export default empty object. And also within TypeScript, we can add in as I command. This is an interface that comes with Warnoff-Keys commands, so we have easy auto completion here, and we get to see all the different properties that we can have within our command. So to start off, I'll have a category, and I will call this configuration. We can also have a description, which will be sends a message. And now we want to specify who can actually use this. So I can say permissions, and these are default Discord permissions. In this case, I'll just have administrator. That way, not anyone can send messages, which obviously you wouldn't want. We can now specify the arguments for this command, so what information we need. And there's 2 things. The first one is going to be the channel. The second one is going to be the actual message to send. So like I said, the minimum number of arguments will be 2. I can specify what each argument is going to be in terms of its name. So like I say, expected args will be a string. Here we'll have channel, and then we'll also have text. Now, because this is going to be a legacy command with !send, as well as a slash command with /send, I want to specify what type of variables channel and text are going to be. So I can add in expected arg types as an array, and each individual string here will be a type that you can pass into a slash command, and each one will correspond to its matching type in the expected arg string. So for example, here we're specifying the type of variable for the channel argument. In this case, we want channel. And here we're specifying the type of variable for the text argument. In this case, we want string. Alternatively, you can pass in your own options here if you're familiar with how slash commands work. But behind the scenes, Warnoff-Keys commands will make your own slash commands with this information here. So now that we have that, we can go ahead and say slash will be the string of both. This way it is a legacy command and a slash command. And then we can say test only is true. And whenever you're using test only within your main file, you want to specify the test servers as an array right here. So going back in here, specify guild only is true. That way this command won't work within direct messages. And finally, we can add in our own callback method that will be ran whenever a user actually runs a command. So I can say callback as an arrow function. And within here, an object will be passed in that we can destructure some properties from. So within here, I can use control space to see all of those. Some of them that we're interested in will be the message, as well as the interaction, and also the arguments, which is going to be an array of strings for each word passed into the command. Now this message property here will only be sent to you if it was ran as a legacy command, for example, with !send. And the interaction here is the interaction for the slash command, and this will only be sent to you if they're using a slash command, for example, /send. So going into here, the first thing we want to do is gain access to the channel, whether it's from mentions on a legacy command or options on a slash command. So I can say const channel equals, and then we're going to use a ternary operator to see if this is a legacy or slash command. So message question mark. In this case, we know it's going to be a legacy command. So I can say message.mentions.channels.first. And then otherwise, if it's a slash command, I can say interaction.options.getChannel. And then we can pass in the string that represents the actual channel name. In this case, it'll be channel right here. So I can say channel. Now, if you are using TypeScript and not JavaScript, you're going to want to select all of this code here and wrap it inside of parentheses and then say as text channel. But if you are using JavaScript, you could ignore this step here. In the next step, no matter what language we're using, we need to make sure that channel is an actual text channel. So I can say if not channel or channel.type is not exactly equal to guild_text. So in this case, we can return a string, which will reply to either the legacy command or the interaction from the slash command. So I can return, please tag a text channel. So after this, we now know that the user has tagged a valid text channel, so we can go ahead and send our message in there. And the arguments array is going to be an array of each word that was passed into the command. So for example, if I say !send, general chat, and then hello world, the array will look like this. And so we don't want this general chat right here. So we can remove the first element of an array by saying args.shift. Now a random args.shift is kind of confusing, so I'm going to add in a comment saying remove the channel from the arguments array. I can also remove these comments here. And now what's left in the array is going to be all of the exact text that the user wants to send. So I can say const text equals args.join with a space. This will take an array such as hello world and convert it into a string that is hello space world. So then once we have this string, we can then send it to the channel. So I can say channel.send text. And now we can reply to the interaction because slash commands do require an actual response. Otherwise, they'll show an error to the user. So first, let's make sure that this was actually ran as a slash command. I can say if interaction.reply. Can pass in an object here where the content will be sent message. And then we're also going to pass in ephemeral is true. That way only we see this response. And this is all we need for our actual send command. And before we write the logic for the auto rolls, I'm going to make sure that this command works. So I'm going to open up my terminal. You can open one by going to terminal, new terminal, or use whatever shortcut you see right here. So inside of here, I'm going to run npm run dev. And one quick note is that if you are using TypeScript and you are running this with TS node, you want to make sure TypeScript is true right here. If you're not using TypeScript or you don't know what TS node is, then completely ignore this. So here we see it has loaded one command. So I'm going to go into here and I'm going to say send in general chat, hello space world. And here we see hello world right there. And if I were to say send test hello world, it'll then say please tag a text channel. So everything is working so far with the send command. So now I'm going to create a command that will take an existing message and it'll then add on its own drop-down menu and it'll also add on its own roles from the same command. So going back into VS Code, I'm going to stop the bot for now. And then I'm going to make a new command here called addrole.ts. And if you're using JavaScript, of course, you'd want JS instead. Within here, it's going to be very similar where you want to export an object. So if you're using JavaScript, you'd use this syntax here, as I previously mentioned. But because I'm using TypeScript, I'll use the export default syntax. So going back into this file, I can say export default empty object as I command. I can go ahead and import this. And within here, I'm going to specify the category as configuration, the description as adds a role to the auto role message. And of course, you can add whatever you want for these. The permissions will be administrator, just like the other command. We can specify a minimum number of arguments as 3 and a maximum number of arguments as 3. This will force the user to have to include every single argument we want. And for the arguments that we actually want, we'll say expected args as a string. Here we'll have a channel. We will have a message ID, and then we're going to have a role. So now we can specify what type of arguments these are with expected arg types. Here we're going to have channel, and then a string, and then a role. Having channel and role here will allow the user to actually tag what they want. And the string here is obviously just going to be because this is a message ID. Now there are better use cases for this for your actual public bot, such as looking through the current channel that was tagged and finding the last message from the bot. However, the message ID is going to be the simplest and fastest way for me to demonstrate the full functionality. So I'm going to go with that method for this tutorial. So moving forward, we can say slash will be both, test only will be true, and guild only will also be true. Now we can add in our callback function, which as I previously mentioned, this will be invoked whenever the user actually runs this command. So I can say callback as a function here. We can destructure some properties here, such as the message, the interaction, the arguments, And within here, we want to gain access to the channel similar to how we just did in the previous command. So I'm going to go over to the send command, and I'm going to copy all of this code right here and use Control C or Command C on a Mac to go ahead and copy it. Going back, I can use Control V or Command V to paste it. And here, if you're using TypeScript, you will have to import text channel. So just click on the end and do Control space. It should be automatically imported right up here. So now we need to gain access to the message ID. And because channel is only going to be its own individual element within the args array, we can access index 1 to gain access to the message ID. So I can say const message ID equals args index 1. Now the next thing we need is the role, and we can get it in a similar way to this concept here where we got the channel. So I can say const role equals message with a ternary operator. Here I'll say message.mentions.roles.first, or we can access the interaction. So interaction.options.getRole. We could then pass in role, and this string here has to match the exact string you put in expected args right up here. Now again, if you're using TypeScript, you want to select all of this code here and wrap it inside of parentheses and then say as role. You can use Control space to go ahead and import that. And if you're using JavaScript, you can go ahead and skip that step. So now we need to make sure that this role actually exists. So I can say if not role. I can return saying unknown role. So now one of the last steps we need to do is see if the message that we're going to get from this message ID here already has a drop-down menu. If it does, we're just going to add this role to it. And if it doesn't, we're going to create a drop-down menu and then add this role to it. So let's go ahead and fetch the message. I can say const target message equals await. And because we're using await, this callback function has to be asynchronous. So we can say await channel.messages.fetch. We can pass in the message ID as well as an object here. We can pass in cache is true. We also want to pass in force is true. This way it'll actually do an API request to go ahead and get this message. And typically this type of call here where we're using fetch and passing force is true isn't something you want to be doing all the time. But because addrole is going to be used sparingly, we can go ahead and use it in this case. So now we can see if this message actually exists. And if not, we can tell the user that they couldn't find the message. So if not target message, we can then return saying unknown message ID. And we also want to see if this message was sent from the user. So within our object here, where we're just structuring all these things, we do have access to the client. So going back down here, I can say if target message.author.id is not exactly equal to client.user.id. And with this, you will have to add in a question mark because in some cases the user might not exist. So here we can return with an error message. So I'm going to use template literals here, and I'm going to say, please provide a message ID that was sent from, and then I'm going to tag the bot here. So less than, @ symbol, greater than, and then in between the @ symbol and the greater than sign, I can insert in client.user.id. And we're doing this because we cannot edit a message that was sent from another user. So now we have access to the target message and we have access to the role. So we want to see if the target message does have a dropdown, and if not, we want to create one. So I'll say let row equals target message dot components index 0. And if you're using TypeScript, you want to say as message action row. But if you're using JavaScript, you can ignore this part here. So I'm using let because I want to modify this if it doesn't actually exist. So I can say if not row equals new message action row. So essentially saying if there's not already components added to this, we're going to go ahead and make some. So now we're going to create our own options to be added onto our dropdown. So I can say const option. And if you're using TypeScript, you might want to specify what type of option this is going to be. So I can use colon, then I can say message select option data, and this is going to be an array, and we'll set this equal to an empty array. Now within here, we'll add in an object, and if I use Control space, we see a couple different options we have, such as the label, the value, default, description, and the emoji. So label is what the users will see. Value is what we'll see behind the scenes once they actually opt in to that role. Default is a Boolean that will be if this is the default option shown. Description is obviously just a description, and you can add in your own emojis per role if you want. So for now, to keep things simple, I'm going to just be focusing on label and value. So the label is going to be the name of the role. So I can say role.name. Now the value is going to be the actual value that we want to add to the user as our role ID. So I can say role.id. So now let's go ahead and get the menu. I can say let menu equals row.components index 0. And if you're using TypeScript, you can say as message select menu. And if you're using JavaScript, you can go ahead and ignore this part right there. So now I can say if menu exists, and within here, we first want to see if this role is already part of this menu or not. If it is, we want to tell the user that because adding an existing value, such as role.id right here, to a menu where that value is already present will throw an error. So we want to prevent that if possible. So within here, I can say for const o for option of menu.options. And within here, I can say if o.value is exactly equal to option index 0, which is the array we created right here, dot value. So if this is the case, that means that this role has already been added to this menu. So I'm going to return an object here, and this object is going to be sent to either the / command interaction or as a reply to the existing message for a legacy command. And one-off keys requires us to add in custom as true. We could then say the content as a template literal. We can tag the role, so less than, at symbol, and symbol greater than. And in between the and symbol and the greater than sign, we can insert in o.value. And then after the greater than sign, I can go ahead and say is already part of this menu. We could then add in ephemeral is true to make it so only we can see this. But there's a possibility that this is going to be ran as a legacy command, which means that this is actually going to tag all of the users who have this role. So we want to add in allowed mentions. This will be an object. And within here, we can specify roles as an empty array. This will make it so it looks like we actually tagged the role, but no one is actually mentioned or notified. So now we can go ahead and add this option to the existing menu. So after this for loop, I can say menu.addOptions. We can pass in our option array. And then we will also want to specify the max number of values that the user can select from this dropdown. So I can say menu.set max values. We can then pass in menu.options.length. This will essentially make it so we can select as many options as we want. And this is very important because let's say that I set this to 2. The users could only select a max of 2 options from the dropdown. So as we add more things in, we want to make sure we update this value here. That way the user can select all roles if they want to. Now, if the menu doesn't exist, we want to go ahead and make it and also add this option to that menu. So I can say else. I can say row.addComponents. I can pass in a new message selector menu. And then we can add on a couple different methods here. For example, I have set custom ID, which is going to be the unique ID attached to this menu, which we will get whenever a user interacts with this menu. So I'm going to call this auto_roles. You can add whatever you want. Just make sure it is unique across all of your different interactions. Next, we can set disabled, which obviously we don't want. We can set the minimum value, which will be 0. That way the users can opt out of all roles if they want. We can also set the max values to 1, because when we're just creating this menu, we're only adding this initial role option right here. So therefore there's only one option, and so the max values can be 1. And as we add more of them, this will be updated with the previous code we wrote. So afterwards, we can set a placeholder text, which will be the text that you're going to see on the dropdown before you actually select an option. Here we can say, select your roles, ... Of course, you can add whatever you want. And then finally, we want to add options and pass in our options array. So now we're going to want to edit the target message object to add on this new component. So I can say target message dot edit. We can pass in an object here. We can pass in our own components as an array. And here we can pass in our own row, which, if you remember correctly, is a message action row, which is what we need to add onto the components right here. Now afterwards, I'm going to go ahead and return something that'll be a reply, letting the command sender know that everything worked. So I can return an object, starting with custom is true. And again, this is something specifically for one-off keys commands, so it understands what you're trying to do. We can add in content, which would be a template literal. So I'm going to say added, and then I'm going to tag the role. So less than, at symbol, and symbol, greater than. And then in between and symbol and greater than, I'm going to insert in role.id to the auto roles menu. Now, because we're tagging the role, I'm going to say allowed mentions as an object. Within here, roles will be an empty array, so people with the actual role won't get mentioned or notified. Then finally, we'll say ephemeral is true, in case this was to use as a / command. That way, only the command sender will see the response. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to open up a new terminal. I can now run npm run dev, and of course, use whatever script that you want to use in order to run your bot. So going into Discord, I can now use the send command, send a message in general. We'll just say select your roles. And now I can get rid of this interaction. And if I copy this ID, I can now add a role mentioning channel and then the message ID. And then for the role, I can tag, let's say Discord.js videos. It'll then say it added that role to the auto roles menu. I can dismiss the message. And here we see this right here. If I click on this, nothing actually happens. That's the last step to do. But I'm going to go ahead and add on 2 more roles to this just so we can see all of them. So I can say add, mention the channel, the ID, I'll paste in, and then I will tag HTML, CSS videos. And then finally, I'll add in 1 more, which will be the React.js videos role. So now in here, we have 3 different roles where I can select whichever ones we want. I can select all of them or none of them. And the last step is to listen for whenever this is actually used. So going back into our code, we can scroll all the way up to when we created our callback function here. And one of keys commands allows you to have your own init function, which will be invoked whenever this command is ran. So within here, we'll be creating our own event listener to listen for whenever an interaction is created. The first parameter here will be a client. And if you're using TypeScript, you'll have to specify what type of parameter this is by doing colon and then client. And if you're using JavaScript, you can ignore all the highlighted code here and just simply use client. Now within here, we're going to go ahead and create our own event listener. So client.on interaction create. This will give us our own interaction parameter here. And the first thing we want to do is to make sure that this interaction will be a select menu interaction. So if not, interaction.is select menu. This is a method, so we can call it. We can then return. Now we want to destructure some properties from this interaction. So I can say const empty object equals interaction. And then within here, we're going to have access to a custom ID, which is going to be the exact string we passed in right here for auto_roles. And checking against this string will make sure that we're using this dropdown menu instead of another dropdown menu, which would still trigger this event here. We also want access to values as well as member. So now I can say if custom ID is exactly equal to auto_roles. Within here, we know for sure that the user has actually clicked and interacted with our dropdown menu for this feature. Now, if you're using TypeScript, you want to add more to this if statement. You can say and member is an instance of guild member, which you might have to import. And if you're using JavaScript, you don't need this code right here that I'm highlighting. So now we want to give all of the current IDs that are selected to this member, as well as remove IDs that were unselected from that member. So let's start off with giving them the roles. Like I say, for const ID of values. Then I can say member.roles.add and pass an ID. And I'm also quickly going to reply to the interaction. So interaction.reply. We'll add in an object here where ephemeral is true. And then we can add in content, which will say roles updated. So now we also want to make sure that we are going to remove roles that were unselected, because currently this won't do this by default. The first thing we want to do is to get all possible options of the selection menu component. So I'm going to say const component equals interaction.component. And if we're using TypeScript, we want to add in as message select menu. If you're using JavaScript, you can ignore this part here. So now I'm going to create an array called removed. And I'm going to set this equal to component.options.filter. And within here, we can pass in our own arrow function. And this function here, we ran for each individual option for this component. So I'm going to call this option here. And now this function should return true or false, depending on if we want this option to be added onto this removed array. So I'm going to return not values, which we destructured from interaction here. This is all of the selected values in the dropdown. So if not values.includes, we can pass in option.value. So now removed is going to be an array of all options that were deselected on the menu. So we can loop through those and remove them in a similar way to this code here. So I'm going to copy this with Control-C or Command-C on a Mac, and I'm going to paste it with Control-V or Command-V on a Mac. Now instead of add, I'm going to add in remove, and instead of values, I'm going to use removed. And now we get this error here because this isn't just a normal string. We have to use .value. So that should be everything we need. I'm going to go ahead and save this so my bot restarts. If I go back into Discord, let's say I want Discord and React videos. If I leave this, It'll then say roles updated. And here I have Discord and React videos. Now let's say I'm no longer interested in Discord videos and I want HTML and React videos. If I leave it, it says roles updated. And now here we have HTML and React videos. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to download the source code, gain early access to new videos, as well as get your own Linux VPS, then consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking on the join button directly below this video.